The secret beneath Lake Tahoe. Imagine standing beside one of America's most breathtaking lakes. The water is so unbelievably clear that you can see deep beneath the surface, giving the impression that nothing could ever remain hidden here. But that beautiful illusion may be the biggest secret Lake Tahoe has ever protected. Today, thousands of visitors come here every year to hike, boat, dive, and admire its crystal-clear waters. California has even created an underwater heritage trail in Emerald Bay, where divers can explore several historic shipwrecks resting beneath the surface. It seems like the perfect place to celebrate history. But history wasn't the only thing waiting below. When water levels dropped after years of unusually dry conditions, researchers and divers began noticing objects emerging along the shoreline, objects that had remained hidden for decades. At first, it looked like nothing more than forgotten debris. But every new discovery pointed towards something much larger. Lake Tahoe has always been known for its incredible depth. At more than 1,600 feet, it's the second deepest lake in the United States. Because of its enormous size, its water level changes much more slowly than most lakes. Even so, recent drought conditions caused the shoreline to retreat farther than it had in years, exposing places that few people had ever seen. What investigators eventually found wasn't some legendary lake monster or a long-lost pirate treasure. It was something far more unsettling. As remotely operated underwater vehicles descended into the darkness, their cameras revealed evidence that had remained untouched for generations. Not because it was impossible to discover, but because almost nobody had ever looked that deep. To understand why these discoveries matter, you first have to understand what makes Lake Tahoe unlike almost every other lake in North America. Perched more than 6,200 feet above sea level on the border of California and Nevada, Lake Tahoe occupies a massive basin carved by ancient geological forces millions of years ago. Steep underwater walls plunge nearly straight down, creating an enormous trench hidden beneath the calm surface. The lake's water rarely rises above 42 degrees Fahrenheit. It's cold enough that a swimmer can quickly develop hypothermia, and remarkably clear because very little organic material survives in it. The surrounding granite contributes almost no nutrients, leaving the ecosystem unusually clean compared with many freshwater lakes. That clarity made Lake Tahoe world famous. Every year, millions of people visit simply to experience water so transparent that visibility can stretch dozens of feet below the surface. But beneath that beauty lies a scientific reality few tourists ever hear about. The deepest parts of the lake behave almost like a giant natural vault. Once heavy objects sink beyond roughly 1,500 feet, they're surrounded by near-freezing temperatures, crushing pressure, and complete darkness. Those conditions dramatically slow many of the natural processes that normally break down materials over time. Instead of quickly disappearing, many objects remain preserved for decades. Some stay there for generations. Long before advanced underwater robots existed, almost nobody had the equipment to explore these depths. The bottom of Lake Tahoe became one of the least visited places in America, not because people weren't curious, but because reaching it safely was incredibly difficult. For years, whatever rested down there simply remained out of sight. And as history has shown countless times, what people can't see is often easy to forget. Everything changed after World War II. Before the 1940s, Lake Tahoe was relatively isolated. Traveling there wasn't easy, especially during harsh winters, and only a limited number of visitors made the journey. A handful of luxury lodges welcomed wealthy travelers, while much of the surrounding wilderness remained largely untouched. The war transformed the region. Military facilities expanded nearby, roads improved, and thousands of servicemen passed through the area. Many were captivated by Tahoe's breathtaking scenery. When the war ended, they returned with their families, their savings, and a desire to build new lives. Tourism exploded. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, hotels, casinos, vacation cabins, restaurants, and businesses appeared at an incredible pace. Entire communities grew almost overnight. But rapid growth created an equally rapid problem: waste. Construction projects generated mountains of debris. Expanding neighborhoods produced increasing amounts of sewage. Businesses servicing hotels and casinos created industrial waste, while aging machinery, vehicles, and equipment constantly needed to be discarded. At the time, environmental regulations were far less developed than they are today. Hazardous waste disposal was poorly understood, and proper disposal methods were often expensive. For some businesses, the solution seemed obvious. Lake Tahoe was deep, extremely deep. Many people assumed that anything dumped into its depths would simply disappear forever. Under the cover of darkness, construction debris, unwanted equipment, damaged vehicles, and industrial materials reportedly found their way into the lake. Local residents were often aware of these practices, but they attracted little public attention, and visitors rarely knew what was happening beyond the shoreline. Across America, lakes and rivers were frequently treated as convenient dumping grounds during that era. What made Lake Tahoe different wasn't necessarily that dumping occurred. It was where everything ended up. Its extraordinary depth, freezing temperatures, and unique underwater conditions preserved much of what entered the lake instead of allowing it to rapidly decay. By the 1960s and 1970s, environmental awareness had grown significantly. Stronger regulations were introduced, conservation efforts expanded, and protecting Lake Tahoe became a national priority. The obvious dumping largely came to an end. The lake's famous clarity remained. Visitors continued arriving. Life moved on, but almost no one investigated what had already settled at the bottom. The technology was expensive. Deep water exploration remained extremely difficult. And perhaps most importantly, few people truly wanted to discover what decades of history had left behind. For nearly 70 years, the lake kept its silence. Then nature exposed the first clue. A historic drought slowly pulled the shoreline backward, and with every foot the water retreated, another forgotten chapter of Lake Tahoe's past began to surface. The shoreline begins to talk. For decades, Lake Tahoe guarded its secrets in complete silence. Then, almost unnoticed at first, that silence began to break. Years of unusually low snowfall across the Sierra Nevada meant less water flowing into the lake. As evaporation gradually exceeded the incoming streams, the shoreline started creeping farther outward than locals had seen in years. A drop of several feet might seem insignificant for a lake more than 1,600 feet deep. But at the shoreline, those few feet changed everything. Places that had remained underwater for generations suddenly became accessible again. Hikers exploring newly exposed beaches started stumbling across strange objects buried beneath the sand and rocks. Old tires, rusted bottles, twisted pieces of metal. At first glance, it looked like ordinary litter left behind over many decades. But divers weren't convinced. Organizations dedicated to cleaning Lake Tahoe had already spent years removing trash from its shallow waters. Among the most active groups was Clean Up the Lake, whose volunteer divers had logged thousands of hours underwater while removing enormous amounts of debris from around the lake's perimeter. By the summer of 2024, their work reached areas that had been inaccessible for decades. What they found immediately changed the scale of the story. Instead of scattered garbage, they began discovering automobiles. Not one, not two, but dozens. Classic cars dating back to the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s rested quietly beneath the water. Some appeared to have rolled into the lake accidentally long ago. Others looked as though they had been intentionally pushed into the water. Many were clustered near old access roads that had once reached the shoreline before decades of changing water levels reshaped the landscape. What surprised divers most wasn't simply the number of vehicles. It was their condition. Lake Tahoe's freezing water had slowed corrosion far more effectively than in most lakes. Paint still clung to portions of the metal. Windows, steering wheels, dashboards, and even interior details remained surprisingly recognizable despite spending decades underwater. Looking through a dive light at one of these cars felt disturbingly similar to approaching a recently abandoned vehicle. Several divers later admitted their first instinct was to check whether someone was still sitting inside. That reaction alone reveals just how remarkably preserved many of these vehicles were. In some cases, faded license plates were still visible. Historical registration records even suggested that a few vehicles had never officially been reported stolen or missing. Somewhere along the way, they had simply disappeared from public memory while remaining almost perfectly preserved beneath the lake. Finding abandoned cars wasn't entirely shocking. Vehicles have been recovered from lakes across the United States before. But what investigators noticed next raised far more serious questions. Many of these automobiles weren't resting directly on the lake floor. Instead, they appeared to be sitting above something else, something buried even deeper beneath decades of sediment. The discoveries attracted growing interest from environmental researchers who had spent years monitoring Lake Tahoe's famous water clarity. Among them were scientists associated with the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, an institution that has studied changes in the lake for decades. As reports from divers increased, it became obvious that scuba teams alone couldn't safely investigate the deepest areas. Human limits had been reached. The next stage of the search would belong to machines. Researchers deployed remotely operated vehicles, better known as ROVs. Unlike divers, these underwater robots could descend thousands of feet while carrying powerful lights, high-definition cameras, robotic arms, and scientific instruments capable of documenting everything they encountered. At first, the footage matched what divers had already been seeing. More discarded vehicles, more construction debris, more evidence that Lake Tahoe had served as an unofficial dumping ground during the rapid development of the mid-20th century. But with every additional descent, the surroundings grew darker. At several hundred feet below the surface, sunlight faded into complete blackness. The temperature remained just above freezing. Pressure increased to crushing levels impossible for an unprotected human to survive. Yet the debris never seemed to end. The deeper the robots traveled, the more evidence they uncovered. Eventually, somewhere around 1,400 feet beneath the surface, the cameras illuminated something no one on the research vessel expected to see. Rows of enormous cylindrical containers, industrial drums, one after another. Some lay alone. Others formed clusters stretching far beyond the reach of the ROV's lights. As operators slowly rotated the cameras, new barrels continued appearing from the darkness. Every direction revealed more. There was no obvious end to the field. It quickly became clear that investigators weren't looking at a handful of discarded containers. There were likely hundreds, and they hadn't arrived there by accident. Industrial drums don't simply roll into a lake and sink to depths exceeding 1/4 of a mile. Someone had transported them there. Someone had deliberately chosen one of the deepest locations in North America. And someone expected those containers to remain hidden forever. The ROV continued documenting the site for hours. Patterns across the lake floor suggested these barrels hadn't been dumped all at once. Some rested in tight groups, while others were scattered over wide areas, indicating multiple disposal events that may have occurred over many years. The deeper the cameras explored, the more unsettling the scene became. Then, near the limits of the vehicle's operating depth, researchers noticed something that immediately changed the mission. Not every barrel was intact. Some appeared damaged, and a few showed unmistakable signs that whatever had been sealed inside decades earlier was no longer staying contained. The discovery that changed everything. As the remotely operated vehicle continued its slow descent, the surrounding darkness became almost absolute. There was no sunlight, no movement, only the powerful beams from the robot's lights cutting through water that had remained undisturbed for decades. Then the cameras settled on something extraordinary. The industrial barrels weren't scattered randomly after all. They stretched across the lakebed in every direction. The operators watched as one rusted drum appeared on the screen, then another, then an entire cluster. Every time the cameras turned, more containers emerged from the darkness. Eventually, it became impossible to estimate how many were actually there. This wasn't a small dumping site. It looked like an underwater storage yard that had been forgotten by history. The people monitoring the live feed immediately understood one thing. These containers hadn't reached the bottom by accident. Industrial drums weighing hundreds of pounds don't simply drift into one of the deepest lakes in America. Someone had transported them here. Someone had intentionally chosen a location so deep that almost nobody would ever discover them. For decades, that plan had worked perfectly. The ROV continued documenting the site for hours, mapping the positions of the barrels one section at a time. Some rested close together, suggesting they had been dumped during the same event. Others lay hundreds of feet apart, hinting that disposal may have continued over many years. Every new image raised another question. What exactly had been sealed inside these containers? The answer became far more alarming when the vehicle descended even deeper. Near the limits of its operating range, several barrels appeared noticeably different from the rest. They were larger, heavier, more heavily corroded, and some no longer appeared completely sealed. As the cameras moved closer, researchers noticed faint clouds drifting away from damaged sections of several containers. At first, they considered the possibility that it was simply disturbed sediment, but the patterns didn't behave like ordinary lakebed silt. The material seemed to be slowly escaping directly from the barrels themselves. That possibility changed everything. If hazardous chemicals were leaking into one of America's most famous lakes, the discovery was no longer just historical. It had become an environmental concern. Researchers carefully collected water samples from areas surrounding the damaged containers. Those samples were sent to laboratories for detailed analysis. Everyone waited for the results. When they finally arrived, the findings confirmed investigators' worst fears. Laboratory testing detected elevated concentrations of several hazardous substances commonly associated with industrial activity during the middle of the 20th century. Among the materials identified were heavy metals such as lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic, along with chemical compounds that modern environmental regulations classify as hazardous waste requiring specialized disposal. These weren't naturally occurring concentrations. Everything pointed toward man-made contamination. By comparing the chemicals with historical records, researchers developed a likely timeline. The majority of the dumping appeared consistent with rapid development between the late 1940s and the mid-1960s. It was a period when Lake Tahoe experienced explosive growth. Hotels expanded, casinos opened, construction projects multiplied, automotive repair shops, dry cleaning facilities, industrial workshops, and numerous commercial businesses operated throughout the region. Many industries during that era produced hazardous waste that today's environmental laws strictly regulate. Back then, proper disposal often cost money. Dumping it into an enormous, seemingly bottomless lake was far cheaper. For decades, many believed the lake's incredible depth would permanently isolate anything that reached the bottom. The freezing temperatures would slow chemical reactions. The darkness would keep everything hidden. And because deep water rarely mixed with surface water, few imagined contamination would ever spread. For many years, that assumption appeared correct. Routine environmental monitoring focused mainly on the upper layers of the lake where people swam, boated, and collected drinking water. The deepest regions remained almost completely unexplored. But time changes everything. Even underwater, steel eventually corrodes. Protective seals weaken, metal cracks, and once those barriers fail, whatever was trapped inside slowly begins escaping. Researchers soon detected traces of contamination at shallower depths than expected. Although concentrations remained far lower than those measured near the barrels, the findings suggested something important. The chemicals weren't staying exactly where they had been dumped. Very slowly, over many years, they appeared to be migrating through the lake. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but enough to raise difficult questions about the long-term future of one of America's most treasured freshwater lakes. The discovery forced scientists to reconsider assumptions that had stood for generations. Lake Tahoe's breathtaking clarity had always suggested purity. But crystal clear water doesn't automatically mean uncontaminated water. Sometimes, the greatest danger is completely invisible. Yet even the leaking barrels weren't the only surprise waiting at the bottom. As researchers continued reviewing hundreds of hours of underwater footage, they noticed objects that didn't resemble construction debris or industrial waste. Personal belongings, pieces of luggage, fragments of clothing, items that hinted at stories no one had expected to uncover. Some of the footage was never immediately released to the public. Officials explained that certain discoveries required additional investigation before further details could be shared. That decision only fueled speculation. For decades, local legends had claimed that Lake Tahoe's incredible depth made it the perfect place to hide more than discarded machinery. Stories about organized crime operating around the Tahoe region had circulated for generations. Rumors suggested that people who vanished without explanation may have ended their journey beneath these waters. For years, those tales remained exactly that. Rumors, legends repeated around campfires and local diners. Nothing more. But after the latest ROV surveys, some investigators quietly acknowledged that parts of the footage appeared unusual enough to warrant closer examination. Exactly what those images revealed has never been fully explained in public. Whether they represent historical evidence, natural formations, or something else entirely remains the subject of ongoing discussion. One thing, however, became impossible to deny. Lake Tahoe was no longer simply a beautiful alpine lake. It had become one of the most fascinating underwater investigations in modern America, and many of its deepest secrets may still be waiting in the darkness. What do you do with the truth? The drought did what nothing else could do in 70 years. It made Lake Tahoe show its hand. By now you've seen the cars. You've seen the barrels. You understand why a lake this deep, this cold, and this dark became the easiest place in the American West to make something disappear. But finding something isn't the same as knowing what to do about it. That's where this story gets complicated. A cleanup that isn't simple. Here's the problem nobody wants to say out loud. You can't just pull hundreds of corroded, decades-old industrial drums off a lakebed and call it solved. Every one of those barrels has spent 70 years reaching a kind of fragile equilibrium. Cold water, almost no oxygen, almost no movement. The moment you disturb one, the moment a robotic arm so much as nudges a weakened seam, you risk turning a slow leak into a sudden release. Divers and engineers who work on legacy contamination sites elsewhere in the country will tell you the same thing. Sometimes the safest short-term option is the one that feels the most unsatisfying. Monitor, document, contain what you can. Move very, very carefully. That's not a satisfying answer for a lake this beloved, but it's the honest one. Meanwhile, the vehicles are a different kind of problem. Not toxic in the way the barrels are, but still historically significant, still holding fuel and fluids that shouldn't sit in a drinking water source indefinitely. Removing dozens of cars from a lakebed hundreds of feet down is its own slow, expensive operation. None of this happens overnight. None of it happens cheaply. Who pays for 70 years of silence? The businesses that dumped waste into Lake Tahoe in the 1950s and 60s did so at a time when it wasn't clearly illegal, even if it was clearly reckless. Most of those companies don't exist anymore. Most of the people who made that call are gone. So the bill, the environmental testing, the monitoring, any eventual remediation falls to the public. State agencies, federal environmental programs, local governments that never created the problem but inherited it anyway. That's a familiar pattern in American environmental history. The people who benefit from cutting corners are rarely the people who pay to clean up afterward. Lake Tahoe is just the latest and one of the most photogenic examples. The legends that won't die. No honest telling of this story can leave out the folklore. For generations, people around Tahoe have swapped stories about the lake's mob-era past, about the casino boom on the Nevada side, about disputes that got settled somewhere other than a courtroom, about a lake deep and cold enough to keep a secret forever. To be clear, those are legends. Colorful, persistent, part of the local identity, but legends. No verified forensic evidence has confirmed what, if anything, those stories point to. Divers and researchers exploring the deep basin have been focused on environmental survey work, not a criminal investigation, and no law enforcement agency has confirmed discovering human remains as part of this research. That distinction matters. It's easy, once you're standing at the edge of something as strange as a barrel field 1,700 feet down, to let the story run ahead of the evidence. The honest version of this story keeps those two things separate. What's been documented and what's been whispered. What happens now? The drought that exposed all of this is already easing. Snowpack will build again. The shoreline will creep back over the tires and the bottles and the places where hikers stood taking pictures of things nobody expected to see. But the deep lake doesn't forget as easily as the shoreline does. The barrels are still down there. The cars are still down there. The data clean up the lake and UC Davis researchers collected is now part of the public record, feeding into the slow, unglamorous work of figuring out what a responsible next step actually looks like for one of the most iconic bodies of water in the country. Lake Tahoe is still stunning. It's still one of the clearest lakes on Earth. That part was never a lie. It's just no longer the whole picture. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If a lake this beautiful can hide something this significant for 70 years just because almost nobody had the technology or the will to look, what else are we not looking at? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if this one stuck with you, the next video covers something almost nobody's talked about, an abandoned reservoir in Nevada that divers only rediscovered last spring. That one's up next.